G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I hope especially you are having a fantastic Friday. Now, the suit is more reasonable today because the people on my Telegram have lost voting privileges over suit and ties. But look, I do then say you should come and join the Telegram. There's a link below. I post all the up-to-date updates as we get them. The geolocations, the full footage that I can't show on here. We have discussions, we have arguments, and it's a place for very, very differing opinions. And people are only ever banned if they're on the absolute extremes or threatening people. Unlike most other Telegrams where if you just disagree, you'll be banned. There's none of that. So come and have a look. But legends, of course, as always, before we head into the weekend, we have a lot to go over. We need to look at the maps. I have a number of geolocations in different areas as well, showing advances of 5 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and these are a long way. And when people go, yeah, but did that ground hold? Well, regardless of what we are seeing, 5 kilometers is a long way. And what I always say is people love to zoom out on this and go, it's nothing. Go and walk 5 kilometers and have a look at how many defensive areas you could have in that as well. So we'll look at all of the maps and we'll compare maps. Of course, we need to talk about these talks. I don't want to call them negotiations, but we'll call it talks that will take place today, tomorrow, when time zone's a bit difficult in Turkey, between the Russian delegation and the Ukrainian delegation. And we need to have a real look at who's in that delegation, because it's not as nobody as people are liking to actually paint this, and what may actually come out of these discussions. What is Ukraine and Russia actually looking for? And then we need to look at as well the most major shuffle in the Russian ground forces of senior command, but where it's a tad awkward, because these two guys that have got reshuffled, well, apparently they were killed years ago. Like I say, with any numbers, any of this, fog of war, grains of salt. But I do want to start somewhere with something that I think is a forgotten factor, and I'm guilty of this as well, of ending wars. This idea that just Zelensky and Putin can end the war, and that's maybe not as easy as it may seem. And there's another factor in this war that hasn't played into previous wars, at least on this scale. And this is my slides on that ending the war for society and the soldiers is going to be much more difficult than historical deals. Because you and I, Ukrainians, Russians, everybody, we have seen this war. We've seen it through phones, through GoPros, through drones. We have seen the horrors. We've seen the war crimes. We've seen the death, the destruction, the savagery in 4K instantly. And what got me thinking about this was a video I saw yesterday, a horrible video of a drone executing a surrendering soldier, which happens far too often, and then it's reposted, mocked, stupid music put on it, and glorified by these pages. And I thought, this is a factor that we've never had. Back in the day, and until recently, soldiers, they told war stories, or waries as we like to say, and they lived through the experience. But it wasn't like this. It wasn't everyone seeing this, from mum and pop at home, through to kids, through to oldies, through every person is actually seeing this. And what I got thinking about was, if that was an Aussie digger, an Aussie soldier who that drone then executed and it was made a mockery of by a country we're at war with, would our boys stop? And I don't think that they would. And it's all well and good for Zelensky and Putin to at some point in the future sign papers, but the war will end when there's no men who are left willing to fight. That at the end of the day, those governments, and your own government, they only have so much control. And we've touched on this a little bit previously, that we need to recognise that it's not ultimately Zelensky and Putin who decide when the fighting stops. In a war that is this brutal and publicly broadcast, it's the soldiers, the military, and society itself. After paying such a cost in this war, do we really expect that these men will just simply, yep, okay, our leader signed, and then we will just walk away? Especially when neither side has achieved its objectives yet. And given the current battlefield reality, it will be Ukraine that will make territorial, security and policy compromises if the war ends in the next, say, months, and we don't know how, but my feeling is from here on it will continue deteriorating, and that this fact alone, this will inflame the already potent nationalist elements that operate within Ukraine. And there's this idea that this has been completely squashed in Ukraine, and what I will say is if you think that a war, an existential war of survival against then your historical enemy in many ways, if you think that softens that sentiment, you're kidding yourself. You might just be seeing less logos, or you're not looking in the right place for then emblems. But this will have lasting consequences, because Russia, they won't be able to stop unless there's total destruction of hostile resistance or guarantees that these now radicalized forces, or more radicalized forces, which will likely grow in numbers, will be squashed by peacekeepers, that they will say we have to continue if this threat still exists. And on the reverse side of this, the major threat for Ukraine is that these same forces could become, or I think will become, a major obstacle for Ukraine's accession into the EU or potentially their NATO ambition. Because what I've said is, well, if those elements don't stop fighting and they're still, and this doesn't just mean fighting the Russians, it can mean turning other ways as well. If that still exists, EU and NATO will probably very likely be off the table. So that will hamstring those policies and future endeavours also. And as I've said before, it's not going to be out of character for Russia's intelligence agencies, whether the GRU, the SVR, the FSB, to quietly encourage more of this radicalisation, even if it turns onto Russia's own lines or then internally in Kyiv, knowing that this would further sabotage any Western integration. So at the end of the day, yes, the leader is at the top making decisions, but whether that is enforced or not is by then society, which the military in a war of this size is a major factor of. But then there's also the other side of the coin, because in a protracted war like this, an army becomes its own beast. And what I say is the front line becomes almost like its own organism. And this is just loosely steered by the government. But if the army's done, the army is done. So on the reverse side to, if they continue to keep fighting, what's the government going to do? But if they go, we're done, what happens then? Because if people stop signing up, mobilised troops, conscripts just refuse to fight, people start walking off the lines, surrendering en masse, well, the decision has then already been made for the leadership. The war ends not because of diplomacy, but because the army at that point may have had enough. And these are real factors that we can see play into this. And society, from Australia to Ukraine to Russia to wherever, is much more aware of how the front line actually looks than those sent to wars of this scale previously. Now, this was a quote from a friend of mine behind the scenes who I want to bring up again. And he's talking along these lines. I just want to add one thing. It makes it difficult for Ukraine to surrender, but it may also make it difficult for Russia to accept a Ukrainian surrender if it did happen, because concerns that the Ukrainian people, or at least the nationalists, were under the mistaken impression that Ukraine surrendered too soon. It could give rise to strong revanchist sentiments. I believe Moscow would only accept a Ukrainian surrender if it came with a peace treaty that stipulated very severe restrictions on the Ukrainian military. But of course, Ukraine at this point in time, they are not going to do this. That's why the war will likely continue, along with concrete means for Russia to enforce these restrictions. Otherwise, it would just be the Second Treaty of Versailles. Failing this, I believe Moscow will feel compelled to keep degrading the Ukrainian military all the way until its eventual collapse, and even crushing of Ukraine as a state. And this is the issue I see in here when you've got societal level wars, is how much does it really matter what Putin and Zelensky then say if the militaries themselves may continue to march on, or on the opposite, they may then refuse to fight. Now, this is going to be far more prevalent on the Ukrainian side due to the Russian soldiers being in Ukrainian territory on the offensive rather than defending your territorial integrity. So that willingness to continue to then may not be there, especially as it will be there, as it continues to attrit. So if Zelensky at Turkey just said, yep, end of war, how confident are we that then the forces would stop or not turn inwards, or at least small packets would then jeopardize ability to join some of these other coalitions? I think this war is going to get very, very messy even after. It's going to continually getting more messy as protracted conflict always gets more messy. But I think even following is going to get very messy. And of course, intelligence services will be leaning on bits and pieces. That is what they do, even if it seems counterproductive, even if it is like, hang on, so these behind the scenes, you're not going to see this, but the FSB is leaning on this radicalized nationalist group to fire into the Russian lines. Yes, because then they can turn around and go, well, they're jeopardizing ceasefire, and when that is happening, there's going to be a pause on integration into institutions also. So I think it's going to get very messy. That's something we could go for hours, and I know I will have missed a lot of points in that. Before we look at the maps, I want to talk about this reshuffle. So what we see from the media is back in 24, top Russian general and 5 million North Korean soldiers were killed by a storm shadow. The Russian general here killed was Valery Solodchuk. This guy right here, okay, was killed by storm shadow. And then back in 22, the 20th of March, we get 5th Russian general killed as planes and helicopters are shot down. This is Lieutenant General Andriy Mordevitchev, who died when Ukrainian forces hit an airfield near Kherson. Okay, but this is where it gets a tad awkward because there's been the largest reshuffle in the Russian ground forces today. So we see Colonel General Mordevitchev has been appointed the new commander-in-chief of the ground forces. Now, this guy was best known for Mariupol and Avdiivka. So he's moved up, and then the guy who's replaced him is then this Solodchuk, and he's been appointed the commander of this group, replacing that guy. So the resuscitation in the Russian medical system seems to be fantastic. Awesome misreporting as well. And this is why I say with any of these losses and whatever, grain of salt. Maybe we will one day see the resurrection of one Prigozhin. Anyway, let's have a look at... Actually, no, sorry, I missed one important part in that. The guy which he's replacing as commander of the ground forces is a hell of a lot older, and we know that a lot of the problem that Russia and Soviet Union had was just aging out men in the Politburo to the military to everything, and that this guy's far younger with far more real-world recent combat experience rather than this older style Soviet throw men at it attitude. Okay, so let's then have a look at the maps, and then we'll talk about Turkey. So, of course, here we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, we're going to turn this on. Now, this came out just as I was uploading yesterday, but it does confirm a lot of what we then did speak about with the red check showing Russian advancement. So, the first area I want to come is what I'm referring to as the tourney front. But you can see that there's really two areas here. Russia pushing at Novye and as well near Torsky. Now, this is, in my opinion, the most critical front line, because if the Russians can get to about here, then they will have full saturation of drones over this area, and all of this is under large threat of a strategic encirclement, not a physical encirclement. As well, near then Torsky is this movement towards Yampil and the thinness of the Ukrainian defensive lines in here that could then envelop Seversk. So watch this space. But we do have a couple of updates in here. So firstly, let's have a look at the maps and have a look at Suryak. Now, what he is saying is the Russian army continued advancing inside Torsky, take control over the northern part. Despite the Russian MOD saying that they've the complete capture, there's still clashes in this sector. And then we have a geolocation. This geolocation right here is Russian soldiers holding then a Russian flag. We just need to move on a little bit after seeing some clashes and some fighting. Then we see that flag right there. Now we have a geo confirmation on this flag, and this flag sits where this road turns out to the west, just below that, which from then the Yampalivkia, where the deep state map says, is 5 kilometers behind the controlled territory. And I will do a measurement for then green zone to it's about here, about 2.5 kilometers, which is a very long way. But there has been some doubt put on this. But the thing is, when there's incentive to doubt something, we also need to take that into account. But Deep State has said that this is older footage, that this was footage, I believe they said from May 9th, maybe, yes, here we go, and it was unsuccessful, and that they were captured. So they're saying that this is footage declaring capture, but there is nuance that this didn't really occur, that yes, they moved in that area, so it definitely should be grey, absolutely, but they were captured. This was more of a DRG. But again, wait out on that, because again, the Ministry of Defense for Russia has incentive to say it's captured. Deep State has incentive to say that it wasn't, and it's been repelled. Remember that they're working with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense as well, and they have been in trouble before, in a lot of strife, for releasing then information. So wait out on that. But eventually we will get a better idea of what is then actually occurring. But we did see around Nové that this area up on the western flank here of this has filled in as per Syriac maps. So it's now confirmed by then this Deep State map. So let's continue our way down, and we see Chasiv Yar, and we do see a part of Chasiv Yar coming under Russian control, confirmed by Deep State. Now, many pages are saying that the Russian forces are storming the remainder of Chasiv Yar, and that this will come under control in the next few days after a year-long battle here. But this is very important, because it is the highest grounds and the really last remaining high areas before areas like Konstantinivka, and also all the way to Kramatorsk. I'm very familiar with this area and the lay of the land, and these rolling hills between Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut are incredibly important for things like enfilade fire, and Russia will gain an advantage in this area if they can capture then Chasiv Yar. So wait out on that though for now. Continue our way down, and we have this envelopment getting made between Zoroya, Toretsk, and Novolenivka. Now, I was going to share it, then I thought, no, I won't be a prick today. But basically, a incredibly pro-Ukrainian page saying that this area is very likely to get enveloped from the Toretsk front all the way through to Zoroya in here, given the lay of the land. But also, the infamous words were said that this is not strategically important. So these infamous words have been said, what to me means the exact opposite, and this is a strategically important area forming the flank of Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, and of course, further north of Sloviansk, what could be made from that Terney front. So no, the 270 kilometre squares that would sit if this area did is then important. And we do see Malinivkia, this is more in line with the geolocation we saw the other day, Novopoltavka, some areas coming under control. But then there's another geolocation here near Maralua-Bivkia. So this is, I'll show you the location first. So 3.2 kilometres behind the line. It's really just below where the V's on here. I got it as close as I could. We do see a Russian flag going up here. Now, again, with everything, we have to add an asterisk to many, many things. You see that flag right there. That I haven't seen the footage, but I had someone reply and say, yes, there's footage though, of then these guys getting artilleried. And okay, we'll take that into account. This should definitely, at minimum, be grey zone. But also, what we don't see in this is if they got artillery or not, but there's not presence of Ukrainian forces at the location where they are. So that grey zone should be much further out, and likely the red zone further as well. So we do see some major advancements on the line. And what I always say is a lot of pages love to just focus on one thing, whether it is losses and not showing maps, or maps and not showing losses, where both are very important in attritional war. But we have seen from Sursky's numbers today that since March, Russia has raised their forces by about 20,000 personnel inside of Ukraine. It doesn't take into account other areas in Russia. So that is, there is an update there as well. So We'll continue moving our way down. I don't think we had any more no, I've shown you all of this. And then we have the Velika Novosilka front line. And what we're looking for is Vilny Pole out from Plevleny in here on that western side. And we do have a geolocation here. So just sort of under the just to the eastern side of this road that runs to Shevchenko, 2.3 kilometers behind the line, we then do see Russian forces operating in this area. So definitely grey zone. Then these maps are saying controlled, but we do need to take things all the time with multiple comparisons across maps because we have a much higher threshold for acceptance of movements, not only geolocations, but also then opposing maps, confirming things. But very likely, well, the grey zone is definitely out through this sector. I think most likely this smaller area has come under control, but weighed out on that. So that's all of our maps today. But Turkey, well, we know that this was never really going to go anywhere, even if Putin arrived. What realistically did we think was going to be the outcome of this? But Zelensky has been very, very critical of the delegation that Moscow has sent. He said that this is a sham delegation. He says the level of the Russian delegation seems more like a mock setup. We will think about what to do next and decide on our steps. So we know the Thursday talks were cancelled, but today, Friday, there will be talks take place. But this delegation, we may have been a little bit hard on this because what we do know is back in 2022, the guy leading up that delegation for the Russians is also the one leading this up. And this gentleman here, Mr. Mark Goaletti, he works at Mark Intelligence, also things like RUSI and a whole bunch of other like think tanks in the academic space. He has spoken about this, and he says it's easy and not wholly untrue to sham Vladimir Medinsky, of course leading up the Russian side, leading the delegation to Istanbul as a nobody. But perversely, although I think it's monstrously unlikely anything meaningful will come from the talks, the composition of the delegation is encouraging. So a vastly different view to how many are seeing this. Putin was never likely to attend. Not least as he wasn't going to allow it to look as if he had been manipulated or dared by Zelensky. Also, if Putin went for presidential discussions, that does confirm Zelensky's legitimacy to Putin, or at least on the global stage. Sometimes it can help break a logjam, think Reagan and Gorbachev, but leaders usually turn up to seal the deal at the end of the process. And this is what we have said, is the leaders, they're not the ones doing the nitty gritty. They're there to sign at the end or to move past then a logjam after the experts have done all the hard preparatory work away from the cameras. Do we honestly think two men who so plainly loathe each other and who have been shamelessly posturing for Trump's benefit were going to reach some kind of meeting of minds? Possible, but unlikely. Medinsky led the talks in 22 that failed to reach a usable deal. We can discount the myth that Zelensky was about to agree to Russia's demands until Boris Johnson nixed it. So this is meant to signal continuity in process and demands. What I will say in 2022, by all the people that have spoken about that who were there from the Turkish side, I believe the Israeli side and others, it looks like that deal was all but signed until Mr. Johnson had something to say. And Johnson is on a worldwide bloody tour at the moment trying to pin everything on the US, a little bit like Murray's on a worldwide tour trying to pin everything on Dave Smith. It's not going that well. Medinsky's very lack of personal authority isn't a snub, so much as a sign that Putin wants to manage any process by remote control. He's a human drone, which at least means any positions he advances and agrees already have Putin's okay. So he will have been briefed by Putin, and then is an extension of that in this working group. The rest of the delegation, likewise, it isn't showy, though the presence of military intelligence chief Kostyakov is interesting, as they were key in prisoner of war swaps, but likewise meant to signal a willingness to do serious work, although this doesn't necessarily make the necessary compromises. So again, this is a proper working group. It's not just nobodies. What Zelensky will say is, but no one has authority but Putin. But what Mark is saying here is, yeah, but Putin will have given these guys very strict instructions as an extension of himself. And mobile phones exist too. Of course, with no hint that Russia is about to relax its implausible and unfair demands, this may all be for show, and probably is, alas. But talking is always good, as there is a chance, however minuscule, that talks can lead to somewhere. Mark, you're not allowed to say that talking is good. You get in trouble, mate. So, although Medinsky is a shadow ideologist, and sending him is a way of a snub, a means for Putin to try and reject Zelensky's challenge while not looking wholly uncooperative in Trump's eyes. That's important. Put a pin in that. Whereas, before I was 99% pessimistic about talks, now I'm 98%. That is much room for optimism as there is these days. And I agree. I am more optimistic with the working group. Well, more optimistic than nobody coming in. It actually is a working group. So what is going to happen here? And what we do know is Zelensky's delegation, they are apparently going forward, then led up by now the defense minister to meet with the Russian delegation. This is the first talks in 3 years. And he's really hammered on Russia for not sending anyone who actually makes decisions and accusing Moscow of not making efforts to end the war. Realistically, efforts to end the war, I don't think anyone can really stick up their hand from Trump to Zelensky to Putin to whoever and say given the realities, we are really trying to end the war. So there is a number of meetings in Istanbul of makeups of then mediated by Turkey, but Russia, Ukraine, America, Russia, America, Ukraine, America, in, well, the reverse order of what I said. So the USA will get an idea with Ukraine, then blah, 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 through to that, then finalised meeting of Turkey mediating this with Russia, Ukraine, and America and seeing how that really goes. We know Marco Rubio, he will be there, and he's the US Secretary of State, and he's also planned to meet with representatives of the Ukrainian delegation, but he's also refused to meet with the Russian side, since he says the Russians sent a lower-level group. The equivalent to Rubio would be Sergei Lavrov. Now, these meetings will take place, but myself and then Mark, I agree that I have little confidence that it will actually produce anything major, as neither party is willing to make concessions. Although just Zelensky being open to meeting Putin is a level of concession, given that they'd have to change a law for that to occur. Now, for Ukraine, they're going into this saying that they want a 30-day ceasefire that is unconditional, that would only have an impact on Russia's side while giving Ukraine then room to breathe, but while maintaining all of the other sanctions and everything on Russia while rearming and rotating forces. And both Turkey and the Ukrainian team, they have reaffirmed their commitment to Ukraine's full territorial integrity, including Crimea. For Russia, they've reaffirmed their commitment to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and pushing for a negotiation to end or resolve the conflict, not just the ceasefire. So as you can see by the absolute basics here that I've pointed out, it's very, very far apart. Now, from a source behind the scenes, that my view is that the European Union, Ukraine, never wanted talks, but what they wanted was to make Russia look like a holdout so they could get Trump to agree to a strong sanctions package. The view is that the United Kingdom, the European Union sanctions are basically useless without America. Even then, I think China is in a very combative mood and would ignore secondary sanction risks. Also, not sure the United States wants to complicate trade talks with China. As we have seen, there's been some success there. Secondary sanctions, it's going to make that a nightmare. This is where the United States and the European Union would show themselves to be full of shit, because they like to talk about sovereignty. And this is one of the bases of liberal capitalist democracies. But secondary sanctions are the greatest violations of a country's sovereignty, which is correct, because what you were saying to countries, really, the big ones would be India and China, is that we are leaning on your sovereignty. We're telling you not to deal with then a third party. And much of the goal that I see here is to bring the US to balance the power more on your side. To do this, these teams, the delegations, Ukrainian and Russian, they will try and present as being the reasonable party. Now, Russia will have a far easier time doing this than Ukraine will, as their goals and the battlefield reality are not only closer, but they don't rely on billions of dollars more from America. Now, the question isn't who does Trump think is more reasonable. It's more who does he think's demands are more unreasonable. And the fact of the matter is, taking into battlefield realities, is that Russia is taking more ground than Ukraine returning it. So when you're talking about territorial, then who's being reasonable, that's very, very difficult there. And I'm not saying either of the demands that all of Crimea or all of Donetsk, given two very opposing views, are reasonable. But I'm saying that if you were to put that across a sliding scale, where does that sit? Well, Russia's still advancing on the battlefield. And in the case of Crimea, Luhansk and other areas, by percentage, then occupy the majority of that. And Trump is more of a realist than an idealist. And Marco Rubio has spoken about Trump not attending and that nothing really will get done without Trump then being involved directly with Putin.
We don't have high expectations of what will happen tomorrow. And frankly,
this is in reference to Turkey, by the way.
At this point, I think it's abundantly clear that the only way we're going to have a breakthrough here is between President Trump and President Putin.
So I'm not confident we're going to get anywhere. The only breakthrough is going to be Trump and Putin. And then Trump aboard Air Force One, he has said very similar. The question is asked, are you disappointed in the level of the delegation that the Russians sent to Turkey? He said, I don't know anything about it. I'm not disappointed in anything. Where are you from, BBC? I'm not disappointed. Why would I be disappointed? Talking about the deal done. But he says, are you disappointed in the delegation?
Disappointed about a delegation. I know nothing about a delegation. I haven't even checked. Look, nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together, okay? And obviously he wasn't going to go. He was going to go, but he thought I was going to go. He wasn't going if I wasn't there.
So, again, saying that nothing's going to happen until it's me and Putin in a room. He was going to go if I was going to go. I was going to go if he was going to go. Bit of Spider-Man finger pointing, and then nothing's going to happen unless those two are in a room. I'll be very interested to see when that then happens. But again, my forbidden question is, what then occurs if Putin just says no? If Trump says, look, I want you to stop the front line where it is, and these are the conditions, what happens if Putin just says no? Because I had someone in the Telegram to go say, well, then Trump would mobilize $500 billion and would push the Russians back using the Ukrainian forces. But money's all well and good, but it's going to take years to get that equipment working on the front line because you lead time on training, on delivery, on training, on mobilizing guys to do it. That's years and years and years. It's more of a manpower problem than it is a weapons problem at the moment. That's the forbidden question. What if Putin just plays hardball here? That's the question nobody has an answer to at the minute. And then this gentleman, this Sebastian Gorka, I don't know if I can expand this, but he is the deputy assistant to President Trump. He works in the White House and also in counterterrorism as well. He's pushed back on this journalist here. And I've got to admit, I do love seeing when like a proper academic really pushes back on a journalist. Like the best way of this ever is people like Hitchens, the old Hitch slap. But you can see that he lays down as well how the US is seeing this in a more realist sense. And I think this is important to see.
Has said that the idea of Crimea being recognized as sovereign Russian territory is on the table. Do you think that some of those regions in the Donbass that have been under Russian control, is that and should that be on the table as part of these negotiations?
So I know you're from the Donbass, and this is personal to you, but I will not comment. It would be incredibly reckless of me. And I told you outside that I will countenance maybe one question on Ukraine because I'm the senior director for counterterrorism. So we're kind of exhausted that topic at this point, but I'll tell you this. We live in the real world. The Trump administration lives in the real world. We recognize the reality on the ground, number one. That's the
live in the real world, and number one is we recognize the reality on the ground. This is where this guy and Keith Kellogg would butt heads.
Beginning, because we're not utopianists and we're not human engineers. We're not
utopianists. Word we use a lot.
Kind of pie in the sky believers in utopia. We recognize the reality on the ground, and we have one priority above all else, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's Ukraine. It's to stop the bloodshed.
So we have one priority.
Everything else,
above all else, is to stop the bloodshed. It's not really. The US's number one priority is working as a power balancer, as the global, well, regional hegemon, but the most powerful country in the world. Of course, they're not the hegemon in Asia, but is to stop another party getting that to balance power as well. And this is done through many different ways and factors. It is not to stop the bloodshed. That's where I do vehemently disagree on that, because the increase in bloodshed has been done many, many times by the US, and the US, liberal utopianists, how people may see, have many, many times sided with autocratic, irrational states from many different areas, both from smaller nations to major nations over the time, to stop an overall balance of power as well. World War II is a very good example of that, with then deals made between the Soviets and the Americans. So and that is trying to reduce that balance of power as well. And you can look at then at the Japanese and then the Soviets at the time too, and where the US came into play there, not wanting then a two-front war. But that we do see, at least from what he's saying, and I'm not saying it's all BS, I'm saying it's more of the accepted line rather than the US first and foremost needs to maintain dominance, is first and foremost is the battlefield reality. And this is why the battlefield reality is ignored by most of my colleagues on YouTube, because they don't like it and their audience doesn't like it. I'm not saying we like it, but we'll continue telling the truth, because I think some people are going to firstly face some hard truths at one point, and I think a lot of people are going to lose their audiences when it becomes like, hang on, I thought this was happening back then. Anyway, legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.